thank you all for coming to this new economics briefing responding to yesterday's budget. I'm Wynne-Jones. I write the Real Britain column at the Daily Mirror, standing up for our readers and campaigning on social justice issues. I also run a few of the Mirror's other kind of harebrained schemes, including Britain Talks, where we bring Brexiteers and Remainers together to chat. I ran the Wigan Peer Project, spending a couple of years retracing George Orwell's steps across the north of the country. I'm also involved in a new investigative project called Is Work Working, which is shining a spotlight on the gig economy. So far, we've taken on Amazon and we're currently looking at Deliveroo. It's wonderful to see so many people here on a Thursday night in lockdown. It would be great to know who you all are. So do write your name and a bit about yourself in the chat. I can see some people are doing that already. The chat is also the place to ask questions of our fantastic speakers. Do please ask away and we will try our best to get them answered. And you can also join on Twitter using the hashtag #NEFBriefing. So what did the budget mean to you? I think in some ways it mattered more to all of us than any budget that I can remember. Even in terms of COVID regulations, our interactions with the state are happening in ways we might not have previously imagined. And what did the budget mean for progressives? The work that I've been doing over the last 12 months in the Real Britain column has mainly been to try and reflect the experiences of those at the very bottom of the economic pile during the pandemic. I think it's fair to say that despite the Chancellor's fancy smoke and mirrors, this wasn't a budget for those people. Yes, the £20 uplift to universal credit was given another 6 months, but that's still a devastating cliff edge waiting in autumn. And most of us here know that our benefit system is one of the meanest in the OECD. There was nothing for disabled people who've still received no uplift at all. The Chancellor refused to even accept the delivery of 200 letters from disabled people this week, which included testimonies that spoke of people having no money for incontinence pads, heating or bathing. There was nothing for key workers who've given everything, even sometimes their lives during the pandemic. No mention whatsoever of social care or sick pay, and no new money for schools or childcare, and never mind for those with no recourse to public funds. We've also seen some blatant electioneering that the Mirror's been picking through today. Of the 45 towns benefiting from the £1 billion Towns Fund unveiled by Mr. Sunak, 40 have at least one Tory MP. And there's been a fuel duty freeze in a country about to host the COP26. Yet somehow this budget has also mortally offended Thatcherites. Guido Fawkes has the Chancellor dressed up today as Red Rishi. John McDonnell has said that people have suggested that he'd do Rishi for plagiarism. The Telegraph was foaming at the mouth this morning. Sunday Telegraph editor Alistair Heath wrote that Sunak's budget showed that Conservatives now think growth materialises like manna from heaven. I think some of us on the left may have heard that before. He called it a shift to the left on economics, sinking ever deeper into a social democratic, low-growth European-style model. He said Labour will be emboldened. So should Labour be emboldened? Or is this smoke and mirrors act the way a future Prime Minister intends to hold on to shifting ground politically? Is Red Rishi about to join momentum? Or is this actually an austerity budget dressed up for the red wall? Helping us unpick the rhetoric of yesterday, levelling up, doing everything it takes, eat out to spread it all about, as Marina Hyde calls it, are 4 people who can, we hope, each illuminate a slightly different aspect to this budget. We've got Alfie Stirling, who's the Director of Research and Chief Economist at NEF. He'll give us his analysis of the budget, what was in, what was missing, and what would NEF like to see going forward. We've got Sonali Joshi, founder of Excluded UK, which has done so much to speak up for the 3 million, or is it now 2 million, maybe she can tell us, excluded from government help during COVID. And we'll be hearing from her what the situation has been like for those people and whether it changed yesterday. We're going to hear from Hannah Martin, the co-director of Green New Deal UK. She'll be telling us about the implications of the budget for the climate movement, what their plans are to organise over the next few months. And finally, Bryan Simpson, industrial organiser at Unite Hospitality. He'll be talking to us about what the situation's been like for hard-hit hospitality workers and the plan to win them justice. Each speaker will speak for around 7 minutes each and then answer a follow-up question from the chat. So do please ask questions. So without further ado, I'm going to go over to Alfie.
Many thanks, Ros, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll just quickly go through just kind of some of an overview analysis of how we see things at NEF from what we heard yesterday. I think the big picture here is that going into this budget, the UK was already an international outlier. It was an outlier in terms of public health and having the highest excess deaths in the G7, one of the highest excess deaths in the world, really tragically, during 2020. But it was also an outlier in terms of economic performance. National income in the UK had collapsed far faster than any other country in the G7 as well. And of course, it's not a coincidence that we've suffered on both those terms. But actually coming out of this budget from yesterday, what it confirmed was we are an outlier now on a third parameter, if you like, and that's just preoccupation with our own public debt. A huge portion of yesterday's budget was all about being austere, consolidatory, and it's going to be incredibly damaging over the next 5 years. While other countries have suspended their fiscal rules, they are genuinely putting in place the support that is needed. The UK announced about £50 billion extra over the next 2 years, which is between a half and a quarter of what organisations like the International Monetary Fund, those hardly renowned socialist organisations, think the UK actually should have been putting in. And so fundamentally, the Chancellor was taking a big bet yesterday, and that bet was that the economy is right now like a coiled spring, and all he has to do is just prod it, and it will all spring back into place. And I think obviously many of us do hope that's the case, but it is one hell of a gamble. And actually the real lived experience of families, of businesses on the ground over the last 12 months should be enough to tell anyone that we're going to have to do a hell of a lot more to support people through the next 2 years. I think a fundamental thing that sits behind this, and which is really particularly worrying, is that there's a misanalysis from the government on what was the issue going into this crisis. We didn't have a problem of too high debt levels. What this crisis has shown actually is that whatever your level of public debt, there is a lot of room for government to support the economy in a crisis. The US, Japan, Germany, they all have higher debt levels than the UK, are all borrowing at record low rates, as is the UK. Actually, what was really exposed by the crisis was that you just can't afford to run your public services to the ground, so they're perpetually running at capacity. We went into a pandemic with too few hospital beds, not enough doctors, overcrowded classrooms, and all of these have now taken their toll just in the last year, and we still don't know what the long-term impact will be. And of course, the two are related, because we try to push down on our public debt by squeezing funding over a decade for our public services. Towards the end of this Parliament, the Chancellor announced tax rises, and I think this is one of those smoke and mirrors that Ros referred to, because actually what he's done is he's announced tax rises, number one, not to restore the public services that were actually the core problem going into this crisis, but as I mentioned, to push down on debt. But in fact, because he's announced them to be deferred, there'll be tax rises in the future. They'll flatter all of the public finance forecasts, so he'll be able to say year on year, yes, at some point in the future debt will fall. But of course, just before the election, when these tax rises are supposed to come in, he can just scrap them and he can cut them as an election bung. So it's a win-win situation for him. He can have all the political benefits over the next few years, and then have the reverse benefit just before an election. In terms of what we did get in the budget, it is clear in terms of that coiled spring, what the Chancellor thinks his strategy is. It is all about tax cuts and supply side support, which is extra clever, given that most people have come away from yesterday thinking, oh, he's a tax raising Chancellor. It was tax cuts, big tax cuts over the next 2 years. The main one being this super deduction, where the big problem here is companies will be able to claim, we'll be able to deduct £1.30 in profit for every £1 they spend on equipment and investment. Now that may increase investment a little bit, but the big problem is it's going to actually have a huge, what economists call a huge deadweight loss, because many companies will carry on, would have invested anyway and would have been maintaining equipment, and they'll now get a big tax break for that expenditure. But stepping back, these sorts of measures pushing through tax cuts is a lot like pushing on a string in the middle of a crisis. So there's nobody out there to buy the goods from companies. There's not much good giving them a tax break to produce them. And of course, the other main ticket in the budget, was in a similar vein, was to try and stoke up the housing market, extending the stamp duty tax cut and extending underwriting for 95% mortgages, which again is just going to increase house prices if there's nothing there to improve the supply and the quality of housing as well. So in terms of what was missing, I think for NEF, we think there were two really, really big pieces that were missing. The first really quite massive blind spot, and Ros has already mentioned it, was Social Security. We managed to get ourselves into a place as a country before the budget, thinking that the kind of height of ambition would be to retain a £20 increase, £20 a week increase to universal credit, for completely forgetting that, if we'd had the 2010 system in place, families would have been £3,000. So a family of children without work would have been £3,000 better off under the 2010 system than the current universal credit system. And even with the £20 uplift, that's then £2,000 better off. So we'd already been in a place where not enough pressure was being put on government to go further. And of course, all we did get at the budget was an extension of 6 months for that uplift. It will be cut, that £20, precisely when the furlough scheme is unwound, so precisely when unemployment is about to increase. And some work by NEF before the budget has shown that the number of people in the UK now really struggling for income has risen from about 19 million in 2019 to 20 million people during the summer of 2020. And by November next year, we're expecting that to rise to 21 million. So a huge number of people in the UK, almost a third of the population, and a big increase. And that is, I think, the really quite vast and hidden crisis that we're facing now as a nation. Just on this front, we therefore think Social Security reform is a massive priority going forwards, and NEF wants to shift the debate. So we're no longer talking about defensive manoeuvres, about trying to reverse cuts or stop government cutting further. We think we now need to just reset the goalposts and say, actually, a safety net is there to support people when they fall on hard times, to live a decent quality of life. And so thinking about what do people actually need to live on, and then putting that in place to make sure that no one lives in the 5th richest economy in the world without being able to afford the basics. For us, that starts with a minimum income guarantee, which we've set out proposals, £227 a week as an emergency payment that anyone can get, non-means tested at the point of access. But we want to push further than that and design a system for a living income that would work with the living wage to make sure no one falls below that level needed for minimum quality of life. I think the second big missing piece was direct support for job creation. And here, of course, is intertwined with the agenda for net zero and climate change, and embedding a labour market and an industry across the UK that's compatible with net zero within the next decade. So, if you look at what the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, was saying yesterday, even with the extension of furlough, once it expires in September, we will have at least 800,000 jobs at risk of unemployment, redundancy, or reduced pay from September. And that is even after all the government's tax cuts. So the OBR is saying it's not enough. These jobs will be at risk. So at NEF, we think that the answer is twofold. Number one, we've got to now repurpose our economy for net zero. And that means investment in green infrastructure and insulating homes, which both obviously reduces energy bills, keeps homes warm, but also creates the jobs to do that. But also we've got to think wider than that and think about restoring our public services as well, which not only will put us on a better footing for future crises, but are also very low carbon. If you expand the care workforce, if you expand assistant teachers, nurses, doctors, it's a very low carbon footprint. These are public services. The value is not material intensive. So we think part of the plan is public investment, 1 million new jobs over the next 18 months, and we put in place a proposal to how to do that. And then the second piece is what is the support given to people to transition from the sectors that will be struggling most over the next couple of years. So those sectors like hospitality, domestic tourism, transport, particularly aviation. How can we support workers from those sectors into the new job creation? And here we want to see an extension of the furlough scheme, so it becomes a permanent fixture of our of our economy and our active labour market support. In fact, in Germany, where the scheme was first invented in 2008, was also initially intended to be temporary, but it's now being extended. So it's now a permanent fixture, and they dial up or down the support depending on the wider economic environment. And that's what we want to see in the UK too. But crucially, while we want to see a furlough scheme that's extended and becomes more targeted to give support to the particular sectors that need it, it also needs to incorporate a training offer. So that all these hours people are not working, but are receiving support from government to stay in their job, they're also being given the option to pick up new skills, new training courses, all geared towards the 1 million jobs that we need to create to embed our economy within net zero. I'll leave that for now and hand back to Ros, and look forward to hearing from other speakers and answering questions.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Alfie. It struck me then when you were speaking, we talked a lot, and I talked a lot as well, about the losers from the budget. And I was looking at a question here from Kayla saying the budget's a clever Tory trick to support big business. I was wondering who you think the winners were yesterday. Who won big?
So I think there were two big winners. The first were those that make their money by owning companies. So you had a big tax cut in corporation tax. This is the irony of it all. The headlines were all rises in corporation tax, supposedly, if they happen, but that's not for another 2 to 3 years. In the immediate term, £12 billion of tax cuts for large all companies. But the larger you are, the more you'll benefit. So big winner there in terms of the owners of those companies, the shareholders. The second big winner, actually, again, is a bit of smoke and mirrors, because with announcements like stamp duty cut and the 95% mortgage, that was all supposed to be about, the rhetoric was about supporting people who aren't on the housing ladder. So people that are trying to get access to housing. Now, those are often actually not the people that need most support. It's people who are in rented accommodation, of course, that need much more. But even so, rhetorically, supposed to be supporting those trying to get on the housing ladder. But in fact, both those measures will not help people who haven't not yet got property. They'll hurt those who already have property. They will increase house prices far more than they give support and access to those that have yet not got housing. So because you're not increasing the supply of housing, whether it's new housing or bringing existing housing stock into use, if you just extend more and more credit or more purchasing power, all that happens is the price of housing goes up. And of course, with the stamp duty cut, first-time buyers already have a threshold under which they don't pay any stamp duty, so they don't benefit that much compared to people that already have a property. So I'd say effectively it's those with wealth, whether it's in companies or in housing.
In terms of those tax cuts, Mike Dixon had an interesting question about will the proposed 130% first-year capital allowance, will that lead to more automation, basically, and robots in the workplace? It's quite an interesting question to think whether that sort of investment, will that investment lead to investment in people? Obviously, it won't, because it's not really for that. Do you think that might change the face of kind of capitalism going forward?
So there's definitely a kind of dystopian future where companies invest in automation and technology to replace labour and workers, and in some ways that is what government is actually banking on, because they're thinking this will improve productivity, and that will have all sorts of implications in and of itself. It's actually, I think, less of the real dystopia is not one where everyone's jobs disappear. It's where the labour market gets completely hollowed out, and so middle income jobs cease to exist because they're automated, and all you're left with is either the super rich who receive their income from owning the companies and owning the robots, or you have very menial tasks that are very, very poorly paid, which they're not worth automating because there's not big enough profit to be made. So it's not so much this clear-cut elimination of all jobs, it's a widening of inequality. But actually, I think on the basis of yesterday, that's not what this budget, certainly, we may well get there, but this budget won't take us there, because actually, the big issue here will be those tax cuts will go to companies on the spending they would have done anyway. So it won't increase investment that much. In fact, the OBR don't think investment will rise above pre-2010 levels following this budget. So actually, all it will be is just increased returns for the shareholders of those companies, and they'll invest the same as they did before.
I think, yeah, I saw you do a good tweet on this, basically saying that companies will spend the money that they were going to spend anyway, and nobody will be able to, well, a third of the population won't be able to afford the products that they're creating. which was a really interesting point. I'm going to move on now to Sonali. Sonali's going to tell us about those who've been excluded from help and how that changed or didn't change yesterday. So over to you, Sonali.
Hi, and thanks to Neff for inviting me to join you all this evening and to share some insights from Excluded UK on yesterday's budget, but also some of the context around our lobbying activities and what we'll be continuing to call for. I am myself a director of a small limited company. I work in the film industry. My work is centred around accessibility, inclusion and diversity. I'm also a freelance writer and I work with a team of 200 freelancers. I was myself affected quite early on because I was working on a Japanese themed project loosely intended to tie in with the Tokyo Olympics. Inevitably, that all went on hold quite early on. I was actually stranded in Japan and it was inevitable that that couldn't continue. So when it came to the announcement of the schemes, I soon realised that I would be one of those excluded from the income support schemes announced by the Chancellor. And this led me to start lobbying actively. And through those activities, I was brought together with two other small business owners. And realising the vast scale of the issue, together we founded Excluded UK in May of last year, where a volunteer-run grassroots not-for-profit organisation. And we established in response to the financial challenges faced by individuals and businesses who found themselves entirely or largely excluded from government COVID-19 support. The key focus of our activities has been the fact that the furlough scheme and the self-employment income support scheme fell far short of providing adequate financial support for all who were in need, excluding an estimated 3 million UK taxpayers. Some of these exclusions were most likely oversight, but many of them were clear policy decisions which had arbitrary hard edges to the eligibility criteria, leaving so many shut out of support through no fault of their own. And this, we feel, has resulted in deep unfairness, injustice and discrimination. The end result has been poorly targeted schemes creating huge disparities, and welfare has not provided a safety net. So we now are at a point where those who've been excluded have faced almost 1 year of little to no support. And our overriding calls have always been for parity of support for the full period of the support that was provided by the two schemes. And what we've seen is those shielding the disabled, younger workers, older workers, pregnant women, new parents, women more broadly, have certainly been disproportionately affected. And it has certainly opened up various inequalities. Our activities are very much focused on lobbying, policy and research. And we set up the largest all-party parliamentary group earlier last year, through which we've been working very, very closely to help put forward various proposals ahead of the budget. Those affected fall across all employment categories, all employment statuses and all sectors. I said that we estimated 3 million were affected, but we actually now think that that figure is probably higher. The National Audit Office estimated 2.9 million, but that was 2.9 million who were completely excluded from the schemes. We are also talking about those who we say have been excluded from meaningful support. It's not meaningful if one is receiving very minimal support, and that is certainly the case for many people, but of course there are many, many who've been excluded completely. I'm going to come back to figures shortly, but just to sort of give an overview of the impacts that this has presented for those excluded. Obviously, we're seeing increasing financial hardship from month to month, spiralling debt, a mental health crisis that looms large, knock-on effects on families, households, small business owners, for their employees, freelancers and subcontractors. People are relying on pensions, savings, decimating their future financial security. And naturally, people are turning to families and friends for help, food banks, people are losing their homes, they've been forced to sell belongings, unemployment and failed businesses are a reality. And people's careers are also being destroyed. People who've invested so much in their education, younger workers who've been left with little opportunity to get a foothold on the career ladder, older workers disadvantaged and not being able to look for new work or retrain, and of course the inequalities that have been faced by those in periods of maternity or parental leave and new parents. Our calls to the Treasury have consistently been throughout, certainly now 11, almost 12 months on, that there's been ample time to rectify these issues, and this is obviously what we were hoping to see in the budget yesterday. A variety of non-complex proposals were presented to the Treasury. We were involved in some of those. As I said, our overriding call has always been for parity of support, and not helping people, we feel, is very much at odds with economic recovery. So the key element of yesterday's budget that relates to our activities and what we've been advocating has been around the inclusion of 2019-2020 tax returns for the assessment of eligibility criteria and the calculation period for the self-employment income support scheme. This is something that we have been campaigning around vigorously over the last year. That 2019-2020 tax returns would enable the newly self-employed to access support. So obviously we did see this in yesterday's budget, but looking forwards, not retrospectively. So for those who have now been included, of course, we welcome that support, but it doesn't take into account at all of 1 year of decimated incomes, decimated businesses. And more importantly, it leaves out many more. I'm just going to come back to the numbers that I referred to earlier. The Chancellor referred to 600,000 now being able to access support through the extension of the scheme. The devil will certainly be in the detail, but we would certainly like to know on what basis this figure was reached, because according to ONS data, we're looking at about 200,000 who are newly self-employed. This figure of 600,000 perhaps takes into account some people who were excluded due to not having a minimum of 50% trading profits from self-employment, but that's not going to be a significant number. So we do think that that figure of 600,000 is probably not accurate from what we know from the data analysis that we've done and the statistics that are readily available from ONS. So as I said, the majority of those who've been excluded over this period during the pandemic remain excluded. And that could now be up to 3.2 million. This is according to a recent report from Standard Life Foundation. They estimated that the figure is actually 3.8 million. We do know that the 3 million figure that we had come up with when we first started looking at this in May of last year, it is most likely higher than that due to more recent information and data that we've been able to access. We will absolutely continue our fight for parity for all those individuals and businesses who've been entirely or largely excluded. And we do urge the Chancellor to recognise the ever-increasing hardship faced and resulting debt crisis. And this is one of the things that we've seen day in, day out from the thousands of stories that we receive from people and from individuals and businesses. People are depleting their savings. And as I said, people's future financial stability has been deeply, profoundly affected, and that could well be hanging over people for years to come. This crisis has really highlighted a lack of understanding on government's part of what it means to be a freelancer, what it means to be self-employed, what it means to be a small limited company. The measure that was brought in yesterday does not account for small limited company directors, those who were denied furlough, so that's employees in a wide range of situations, PAYE freelancers, and many other freelancers and the self-employed who've been excluded through the other exclusions. And as I mentioned earlier, there are serious inequalities that have been brought about through the two schemes not having provided parity of support for all who needed it. The Chancellor began his statement yesterday stating that he would do whatever it takes, but that's far from the picture that he actually painted. The impacts we've seen over the last year, felt by those excluded from meaningful support, we feel are only set to become more acute.
Thanks so much, Sonali, for that. It was really interesting and really important to get into some of the detail in the way that you have. I was interested in one thing that you mentioned near the beginning, where you were saying about some people being excluded just kind of as oversight, and some that felt as if they'd been deliberately excluded. And I was wondering, there's somebody's picked up in the chat on that, Marge has said, can you talk more about the conscious policy decisions that led to people being excluded? So I suppose I'm guessing it's because if they include a certain type of person, they would have to include, hundreds of thousands of them. But I'd be interested to know, what's your view of who was left out and why?
Well, one of the overriding or fairly consistent messages, rather, that we've been hearing from the Chancellor, from government, has been this issue of fraud, that the schemes were set up. They were set up at speed, admittedly, but they were also designed to prevent fraud. And I mean, that's for many, that's a sheer insult. But what that really pertains to is probably the issue of small limited company directors, those who the self-employed who earn over, well, whose trading profits are over the 50k cap. Those were almost certainly conscious policy decisions and objections to the schemes being extended, but also the newly self-employed. Originally, it was always mentioned by government that it was to guard against fraud. But when we hear stories and testaments from individuals and the ways in which they've been affected, I mean, it's, like I said, it is an insult to be told that that this is all about fraud, especially when we've heard it's been reported widely how much fraud is being investigated in relation to the furlough scheme. But to answer your question, those exclusions that were perhaps oversight, probably the issues around maternity and parental leave and rights, they probably just weren't even considered. With regards to the 50% trading 50% trading profits requirement, there are things like widows' pensions, army pensions, pension drawdowns, bereavement payments, carers allowance, redundancy payments. There's probably others that that don't spring to mind straight away, but these are some of the obvious ones that we hear very frequently, whereby these payments that people have received through their own personal circumstances have ultimately resulted in these people being excluded due to that 50% rule. And that, we feel, is profoundly unfair and if not discriminatory. But that possibly was an oversight as well, in the sense that that range of personal circumstances perhaps was not taken into account. What is not forgivable, I guess, is the fact that it's taken a year to account for only one portion of the at least 3 million who are excluded, and it doesn't really touch the sides for many.
Well, Britt, thank you for all the work that you're doing on that to bring that to public attention and to government attention. I'm going to move on to Hannah. And Hannah, is this still the greenest government ever?
Still, I mean, was it ever? I don't no, I think no is the short answer to that. But I want to start first by thanking Sonali for your tireless work. I feel like the organising that's been done around the Excluded has been incredibly sort of heart-rendering, obviously, but also really inspiring in terms of how you've organised people and brought people together over the last year or so. I mean, in terms of, I was asked to speak to kind of what are some of the climate implications of this budget. Just to give a bit of context, this is the last budget before the UK hosts the COP Climate Summit, which is the UN International Climate Summit happening in Glasgow in November. It was the last budget before the G7 summit, where we're told, which we're hosting as well, down in Cornwall, where we're told the UK will be putting climate change at the top of the agenda. It's the last budget before the Global Biodiversity Summit. And last month, Boris Johnson told the UN Security Council that climate change was as big a threat to world peace as war. But the words climate and nature were not mentioned once in the budget, in the speech yesterday that the Chancellor gave to the House. And, you know, I think that that shows a really decided dip, both in rhetoric, which this government has been quite big on in terms of climate stuff, and an even bigger dip on action. I think that there are a few things that came out. You know, there was a new National Infrastructure Bank announced to finance the Green Industrial Revolution. Sorry, I should have put that in little quotes, the Green Industrial Revolution. And the Bank of England's mandate will be changed to reflect the importance of sustainability, which is a campaign win for groups like Positive Money and others who've been campaigning for that for a while. And there'll be a new green savings bond. But those don't really touch the sides of what's necessary. And then there are more specific failures. You know, there's very little to add to the 3 to 4 billion to support the Prime Minister's 10-point climate plan, which was announced in the spending review. And it just really pales into insignificance when you compare it to what the environmental stimulus packages look like in, say, France or Germany, or even in the US, where Biden's green recovery package is $1.9 trillion. And then there are measures, some of which have been mentioned, which take us further away from our targets, like another cancellation of the increase in fuel duty, which means that emissions are 5% higher than they would otherwise be at a cost of 11 billion a year to the Treasury. But rail fares are set to rise above the level of inflation in England and Wales. And then you've got the failure to extend or reform the Green Homes Grant, which means that this is supposed to be the government's one flagship green jobs programme. They promised 100,000 jobs. The TUC analysis says that only 15,000 were created, and planned cuts would slash the number to 6,000. So it wasn't great. Across the board, it wasn't great. And this is a big year for the climate movement. You know, we need to secure a really ambitious set of national contributions at COP, but we also need to kind of, in a way, make up for, I think, a slightly lost momentum. 2019 was a huge year for climate action. You saw masses, hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets globally with the climate strikes, but also in the UK with Extinction Rebellion and others. And it felt like there was quite a lot of momentum in 2019 around climate action, with some kind of, you know, symbolic wins around declaring a climate emergency and a net zero commitment. But I think that some of that momentum has been lost over the last year. I think that there has not been the same sense of people coming together to fight this huge existential threat. And I think we've been prevented from doing that and prevented from organising in that way. So in terms of what's the plan to organise, I was rather ambitiously asked to ask, what's the plan for the climate movement to organise over the next few months? I can't necessarily answer for the whole climate movement, but I think that one of the things we should be focusing on is asking for what we actually want. I think that there's an interesting combination of circumstances right now. You know, you have got a government who is going to feel the pressure of the international spotlight being on them at the G7 and COP. You've got Biden in the US potentially making big moves to invest in big green infrastructure projects and green jobs and things like the Youth Climate Corps, and a lot of pressure on him from the Green New Deal movement in the US. You have got a prime minister who isn't necessarily averse to kind of big green spending and kind of that sort of measure. And I think that all means that for the climate movement, this is no time to cut back or scale back our ambition of what we should be calling for. You know, we've put out some analysis earlier this year which works with some of the work that NEF did that suggests that 1.2 million good green jobs could be created in just 2 years. And that includes a bunch of care jobs, because we consider care jobs to be green jobs. They're low carbon, they're necessary for our human flourishing, and they need to be well paid, and they could be distributed pretty evenly across the country. I think that we need to call for, a huge upscaling and ambition, basically, and be big and be bold in what we ask for, whichever part of the climate fight it is that we're looking at. The second thing is that I think we do need to have a focus on jobs. Unemployment's going to be huge. All the rhetoric's going to be around unemployment. And I think that the climate movement has traditionally not been great at talking about what jobs could be created where, what kind of wages you're looking at, what's the transition plan for people, what are the skills that people will need. And I think things like the job support scheme, which NEF have sort of pushed out this week, are a really good way of explaining to people what it could look like to get a green job and how that would work for them. But I think more storytelling around that is really important. And then the final thing is, I think the climate movement, again, has traditionally not been great at talking to people and meeting them where they are. You know, a lot of people have gone through one of the hardest years of their lives in many ways. And I think one of the things we need to get better at is talking about things like income, talking about things like a living income, talking about people's homes and their transport and their jobs and their childcare issues and things that affect people materially in the day-to-day. And that's why we've always been really passionate about the Green New Deal, because it does try to speak to the social and economic issues that people are facing, as well as the sort of pressing climate breakdown that we all need to tackle together. So yeah, there's a few things that you can do if you're interested. They've just been posted in the chat. We've just launched a Green New Deal Rising programme for young people to organise for a Green New Deal across the UK in certain locations. We're doing a big action around green jobs available in people's constituencies. And we're going to be building to COP and launching a plan to win a Green New Deal later in the year. So keep an eye on that stuff coming out. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Hannah, and thanks for everything that you're doing as well on that work. I was wondering whether in terms of the last year, I know in many ways the last year has been a wasted year in so many ways, and we haven't got years to waste on climate. But that whether people flying around, somebody had asked this on the email as well, obviously fewer people have been flying, people have been doing less travelling. We've seen some recovery of the Earth and the planet. And does that give us a sort of hopeful jumping off point that we've been able to show people that, you know, things can recover if we change our sort of impact on the planet? Does that give us any sort of window for sort of hopeful optics, I suppose, as we go forward?
I think in actual real emissions terms, the scary thing is that the pandemic hasn't affected things that much. And that is quite terrifying, really, when you think about how much of a lockdown much of the world's been under. But I do also think that I think it matters that people have begun to appreciate the green spaces that are near them. I think it matters that people have noticed that less traffic in their streets makes a difference to their quality of life. I think it matters that people have realised that working from home can be, you know, productive. And, you know, I think that it matters that people have realised that, you know, there are lots of places you can go in the UK rather than flying as much as you need to. Although, to be honest, as with most things, the huge impacts that we face are not really to do with individual behaviour. They're to do with kind of a small number of very rich people and companies making profits at the expense of everybody else. And so I would always advocate, if you're looking at things like aviation, for something like a frequent flyer levy, where you're actually taxing people who are flying much more than, you know, a family who goes on holiday once a year. They're not really the problem. And so I think that it is this kind of conversation about how, you know, nature has been healing a bit, or like how the pandemic's changed our approach. It's useful, but I do think it takes us into slightly dangerous territory of assuming that individual behaviour is how we're going to get out of this mess, rather than kind of state intervention and huge investment, and also fossil fuel companies shutting down their operations and actually completely ceasing to exist, and changing, you know, the way in which we run our economies. So I think it's useful, you know, it's a useful entry point, for example, for me, when I talk to relatives or friends who are not in this world, who are like, oh yeah, I can hear the bird song, and isn't that a good thing for the climate? Aren't you happy about that? And you're like, yeah, I think what's interesting though, and it's kind of, you know, you use it to bridge to what I consider to be the bigger issue, which has never been about individual behaviour choices that people make.
And also slightly off topic, but the Bank of England's new green remit. Can you tell us anything about that? And do you think, is there any sign there that kind of progressive economics are getting into the sort of mainstream kind of bloodstream?
Do you know, Ros, I'm not sure I can tell you anything about that more than what I said, because I don't know a huge amount about it, and I would be slightly making it up. But I would suggest that people check out Positive Money, who've been doing a lot of work on this, and probably have a much more considered, intelligent response than what I would make up.
Sorry, that was a terrible ambush by the host.
No, don't worry, it's
I'd
fine.
like to
It's just better to be honest, isn't it?
Yeah, and actually Positive Money are fantastic. So that's a good recommendation. So finally, and thank you so much for that contribution. It's really, really helpful and interesting. And finally, we've got Bryan is going to tell us about the hospitality sector. I'm not sure how he's going to do that within 7 minutes, but over to you, Bryan.
Yeah, thanks, Ros. And thanks to Neff for having us along. This has been an amazing event already, and we're still to get into the nitty-gritty of people grilling us. But before I go into the hospitality sector, I suppose I'm also, along with Sonali, representing the kind of workforce that's been let down by this budget. And I think what this budget just serves to highlight is the sheer extent to which the Tories perceive recovery from this pandemic through the lens of trickle-down economics. It presupposes, for example, that employers, many of whom continue to use fire and rehire tactics to benefit from the JRS, it presupposes that they're somehow going to pass on these corporate savings to the workers who actually need them the most, and people like Sonali. Just to quote Rishi Sunak himself, to protect hospitality and tourism jobs, I have extended the cut in VAT, removed business rates, and created a future fund to allow firms to access support for innovation, talent, and capital. So while businesses are getting money thrown at them, let's see what actually workers got. They got a 19p increase in the national living wage. It's now £8.91. That actually represents a 2.2% increase. So when you take that into account, or when you take into account the RPI projections for 2021, which is 1.4%, that goes down to 0.8% increase in the minimum wage in the middle of a pandemic. Furthermore, it falls way short of what we actually need, which is the real living wage in London is £10.85. As Alfie says earlier, nothing about how we retrain the hundreds of thousands of workers that have been made redundant during this pandemic. Nothing about the obscene £95 a week that workers are having to live on if they need to self-isolate, and statutory sick pay, the lowest in Europe. I think it's one of the lowest in the Western world. All of that against a backdrop of a pandemic when a lot of people have not been able to get access to the £500 self-isolation grants that were put in place. In fact, the only direct benefit for workers, as some have already said in this budget, is the extension of furlough till September. But with a tapering off, which will cost thousands of jobs, it did in August and September, asking employers to contribute to it. Even then, there's no obligation on employers to bring newly redundant workers back on furlough. But what's undeniable is that a toxic combination of unscrupulous employers, or practices from unscrupulous employers, and inaction from the UK government has cost hundreds of thousands of jobs. So just looking at hospitality, according to Forth, which is the system which is used by employers to administer staff, the sector's seen a 24% reduction in workforce compared to 2019. That would represent 650,000 jobs lost across the UK just in hospitality and tourism in a year. 650,000. These are young women, migrant workers, some of whom have lost their jobs 3 times in a year. I've represented people who have lost their job 3 times. Fired and rehired by companies who have taken hundreds of millions of pounds from the JRS, from taxpayers' money, only to use it to pay the severance packages of their workforce that they let go. And we're not talking about small family-run businesses here. We're talking about enormous multinational chains such as the Intercontinental Hotels Group, which terminated 95% of their workers in hotels across Scotland, despite the existence of the furlough scheme, They claimed that their hotels would not be open for the foreseeable. They used the job retention scheme to pay 80% of the workers' notice pay. Within a month, these hotels were opened and the workers had been replaced on lesser terms. So that's not just fire and rehire, that's billion-pound companies using COVID as a cover to restructure their business, squeezing even more out of wage costs and contractual security. If the government really wanted to protect these jobs, it would have made all public money, whether that be business grants or the JRS, it would have made it conditional upon employers retaining their workforce. An economically competent government wouldn't have set arbitrary cut-off dates for RTI submissions, which left people like Sonali excluded from the access to the job retention scheme. An economically competent government wouldn't have waited until the day before the cliff edge of the 31st of October to announce the extension of that scheme, something that we put huge pressure on as a trade union movement, and I know that NEF did as well. As part of our hospitality rescue package, there are 5 things that we believe the government can do or should have done to protect jobs, to assure health and safety, and to ensure future sustainable employment. Those are a full furlough scheme for as long as we need it. In other countries, they've had it, or they will have it, for 2 years. Instead of employer contributions, we want to see conditionality placed on employers who access government schemes to pay wages. That means that they commit to adopting fair work principles. So, for example, the real living wage, minimum hour contracts, upskilling in time for the return to a safe workplace. We want to see full sick pay for at least the length of time that they expect these workers to self-isolate. In Australia, it's 10 days as a bare minimum so that they can actually self-isolate. We want to see the establishment of a hospitality commission to investigate those multinational employers like IHG who have made millions from public funds only to terminate the vast majority of their workforce. We want to see the incentivisation of employers to upskill workers instead of mass fire and rehire. But as usual, it's been up to the trade union movement and organisations like NEF as the collective voice of workers and struggle to put the necessary pressure on employers to treat their workers with the respect that they deserve. So over the last 12 months, hospitality workers in their thousands have got together with their colleagues, they've joined a union, many for the first time, and they've forced some of the largest employers in the country to reinstate them, in some cases on 100% wages, even premium payments for those still working through the pandemic. When the Marriott Group, the largest hotel chain in the world, refused to furlough their 1,500 casual staff, a workforce that was majority young women, migrant workers, they clubbed together. They demanded fair and equitable treatment with their permanent counterparts, and they won. They won reinstatement. They won 80% wages backdated till March. When Scotland's largest hospitality employer, the G1 Group, sacked 2,000 workers by phone, our members immediately got to work organising their colleagues. They launched a national social and mainstream media campaign which targeted the company's reputation. Within 48 hours, the company was forced into an embarrassing U-turn and it reinstated all of the 2,200 workers. But most recently at Queen's University in Belfast, the 0 hour workers who had not received a wage for months got together through Unite Hospitality, and with direct action and public pressure, they forced the employer to pay their furlough backdated. COVID, as we've already outlined, it's uncovered deep economic cracks in the sector that many of us have always known existed: poverty pay, insecure contracts, negligent lack of duty of care when it comes to health and safety. But this is why we're launching a new deal for hospitality workers, which demands full sick pay for those who need to self-isolate, priority vaccinations for those hospitality workers still on the front line, a hospitality commission at Westminster, Holyrood, Stormont and the Senedd, which sees rogue employers investigated for their mistreatment during this pandemic. But as Hannah says earlier, COP26 is coming to Glasgow, where I'm from. It's also being held in the Scottish Events Campus, which outside the Excel Centre in London is the largest hospitality workplace in Britain. That is an opportunity to organise hospitality workers. They're already doing it. I suppose what we need from yourselves and everyone listening is as much support as possible to make sure that this industry is transformed from COVID rather than destroyed by it. I'll leave it there, Ros.
That was brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Bryan. And I was just reflecting that Hannah had spoken a bit about UK holidays, and you've just told us where to avoid staying in the summer. So thank you for that. And it was brilliant to focus on COP26 and what we can all do. I think that could be a real coming together of kind of, you know, climate and social justice movements and people acting together. It feels like a very, really positive note to leave things on. I'm conscious it's like 3 minutes to 8. Everyone probably wants to get off and enjoy the rest of the evening. So I might save Bryan from any further questions. But I'm sure that if you drop them in the chat, we could pass them on by email to Bryan afterwards and to other speakers if you want to get in touch. So just remains to me to say thank you so much again on behalf of all of us for coming along today. Thanks to our incredible speakers. You can read more analysis from Neff on the Neff website. There's a link, I think, probably magically appearing in the chat right now. And on behalf of Neff, we look forward to seeing everyone for another New Economics briefing very soon. Thanks a lot.